Welcome to another episode of Electable. I'm Deb Chubb. And today, after the elections in Indiana and all other states, we are very fortunate to talk to someone who knows a lot about getting women elected in this country and around the world. And so this is very exciting to hear about this. And I certainly want to know more about how we can succeed in getting more women elected into government. So with us today, Cynthia Richie Terrell, a founder and executive director of Represent Women, also founder of Reflect Us or Reflect US, I'm not sure, and also founder of Fair Vote. So, Cynthia, you have done a ton of work. And so I would love first if you could just give us a little background on all of these organizations and, what are they all doing? How were they started? And, what can we expect to see from them?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to be on with you. It's always a pleasure to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is women's representation and building a healthy and reflective democracy. I'll start out with my work on campaigns. I really dove into working on campaigns for about 6 years straight, right out of college. And that gave me a really good understanding of how campaigns are run, what the priorities are, what voters matter, who swing voters are, and how our electoral system really functions, and frankly, also dysfunctions, which we can talk more about, in terms of whom it includes and who's excluded from the process. It was after a particularly bruising election cycle, I guess in 1990. And then I ran a campaign for the Equal Rights Amendment in 1992 in Iowa, where I got to debate Phyllis Schlafly and the
Wow.
likes of Ralph Reed from the Christian Coalition, et cetera. We lost that statewide Equal Rights Amendment by just a few percentage points. But that same summer, my husband and I, Rob Ritchie, and some others came together in Cincinnati, Ohio, to really rekindle an interest in proportional voting systems that had been alive and well, actually, during the progressive era in the 1900s in the United States, where a number of cities in Ohio and in really across the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast changed their election system to be more representative of the voters, and which gave voters more power, essentially. And so we had some of the old guard from Cincinnati who had been involved in the 1940s, and we came in as the young people we were then, and worked with a team to start what has now become Fair Vote. And so we're now 30 years going strong, and Fair Vote has been really I would say the early and the constant voice on the need to look at our winner-take-all election systems and understand what the barriers are inherent in that winner-take-all voting system, and figuring out what the data tells us are some good solutions to that system. Mostly now that work has focused on ranked choice voting, which is a system that gives voters more power, more choices, and a greater voice in government. So that's been exciting to see the work of Fair Vote. Now there are, like lots and lots of states with Fair Vote organizations and other organizations, voter choice groups that are working on ranked choice voting. And we've seen big wins for it from places as diverse as Alaska to Hawaii to Utah to Colorado to Illinois to Maine to Georgia. It's used by military and overseas voters, which might actually be something that legislators in Indiana would be very interested in. In Georgia, just as an aside, a Republican legislator pushed successfully to make sure that instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting could be used by military and overseas voters in this election cycle, which is why the runoff is able to happen so close to the general election in Georgia right now. That's something that Democratic and Republican legislators have a history of favoring in southern states. So maybe that's an interesting thing we could talk about for Indiana. So Fair Vote has, I think, spawned not only a lot of ballot measures, which have been successful, but a lot of great cross-partisan work, and then a lot of legislation as well, to pass voting system reform, again, to enable voters to have more power to elect candidates of their choice, and that's
So
the
just as a
kind of
quick definition of the ranked choice voting system, everyone gets to make a first choice, a second choice, and a third choice.
exactly.
And then if your first choice doesn't get enough votes, then that vote is taken out, and your vote then goes to your second choice. Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
right. So a lot of people have trouble understanding that, but that's how it works. And I know that that was instrumental in getting what the first Native American elected in Alaska this year. Um,
Exactly. Yeah, it's a great system, because it incentivizes candidates to run to find common ground. So if you and I are running, I want your supporters to rank me second. So I want to find things that we have in common that we're seeking a solution on, and we see that happening now. There have been, millions of votes cast in ranked choice voting elections in New York and in San Francisco and Alaska, et cetera, et cetera. So we see this pattern emerging of candidates really embracing civility, focusing on issues, finding common ground. And yes, as you say, multiple candidates can run, and this is one of the reasons we think that women tend to do so well in jurisdictions with ranked choice voting, because multiple women candidates can run without splitting the vote, or without being told to wait their turn, which women candidates hear so often. It's not time for you. We already have a woman in the race. But in a ranked choice voting election, we saw this in New York City with the New York City Council, many women running for each of those spots. And then, there 61% of the seats on the New York City Council are now held by women, in part because they didn't split the vote. They found common ground. They were civil. And lo and behold, one nice thing about ranked choice voting is it turns out running positive issue focused civil campaigns cost a lot less money than running these negative attack campaigns, which rely on essentially trying to misinform voters. So that's a nice aspect of it as well. We know money is such a big problem in politics, and it's nice to reduce the need for it. Anyway, so that's another advantage.
And so while we're on this topic of, voting systems reform,
yes,
I saw somewhere in your materials that you did a city campaign for fair representation voting. So, in Indiana, we don't have ballot initiatives. Anything that goes on the ballot has to be approved by the state legislature. So, so we don't have that. And, we don't have an independent redistricting commission either. So I guess I'm excited to think, is there some hope at a city level for Indiana City?
absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of hope at the city level, for policy to pass legislation. You don't even really need a campaign for it or a ballot measure. You can just work with your city councilors, and or the county level for that matter, to change the way votes are tallied. There's certainly a history of it. The campaign that I worked on was in 1991. It was in Cincinnati, Ohio, to bring back the proportional system that Cincinnati had used very effectively for about 20 years, in the 1940s and 1950s. And in Cincinnati, there was a Democratic Party, a Republican Party, and then a strong independent party. And they all just shared power. And it was, I think, voted by Forbes magazine after 2 decades of using this type of fair representation voting as the best managed city in the country, which is a pretty good endorsement of that kind of voting. But now, yes, there have been, I think, over 50 cities use some type of ranked choice voting to elect members of their council. And it just passed in, I think, 7 cities. Let's see: Evanston, Illinois, Fort Collins, Colorado, Portland, Maine, and Portland, Oregon both passed it. So that's fun. And we've seen an explosion of use of it in places like Utah, where there was a local option bill, which that the state legislature passed with a lot of support from Democrats and Republicans, that wasn't mandating the use of ranked choice voting. It simply said, we're going to support local communities that want to make this switch. And so that's been interesting to see a pilot project in a place like Utah, where all kinds of partisans are supporting ranked choice voting.
Interesting, interesting.
Yeah.
So, so the idea is that you can actually get a city council to pass legislation that allows the city elections to use a ranked choice voting system.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And when we first started Fair Vote, and really for the last, or I would say for the first 15 years or so, there were barriers in the actual software and hardware of counting ballots that made it hard for a community to make the switch to ranked choice voting. But now voting equipment is almost all I'm blanking on the word right now, but workable with a ranked choice voting system. So depending on what kind of system, it's usually not a very big expense to make the switch. I actually live in a city with ranked choice voting, and we get a ballot, which is a ranked choice ballot for city elections, and then there another ballot. And that's pretty common around the country, that you vote in one kind of a way or one date for your local municipal government, and then another date for state legislature and so forth, with a different system. So now both the software and the hardware is pretty commonplace, making it an easy switch for local communities. And obviously it's one of those things where the more communities switch, the price of switching goes down, which is another great thing to see.
Right, right. Well, that's very exciting. That's, in Indiana, of course, we had a really bad election experience this time in 2022. So unlike, apparently the rest of the country. So so anyway, so any little glimmer of hope is really, we really need something like that now. So
Yes.
and I wanted you to talk and I want you to talk about the other organizations that you have founded as well.
Right, right. Well, Reflect Us was it's sort of taken a different shape now. It's dissolved from the coalition that it was, but we formed it, a number of us, at a time right in after 2016 election, when we realized there was a great need for bringing women together from across the partisan spectrum to have conversations about how to build women's representation. And it was a really fruitful experience. We got funding from various funders, and really had a great network that was built. And it's since evolved into this state network, or we're going to call it, I believe, the Women's Power Collaborative, which is creating a platform for groups such as yours, working in states or in cities, counties, to share best practices with one another and take advantage of training organizations. There are obviously a lot of great organizations out there that do training in the Republican and the Democratic Party. But Emerge is a great example on the Democratic side. The Women's Public Leadership Network is a good example on the Republican side. Then there are nonpartisan groups like Vote, Run, Lead, and Ignite, and Running Start is a group that we're particularly close to, that all do really great work recruiting women to run and supporting their candidacy. So the Reflect Us Coalition brought together those groups to work together, and we're sort of now in the next phase of it, which is this state network, which Represent Women is taking on. We're excited for that work ahead. Represent Women started as a project of Fair Vote, really, gosh, almost 10 years ago, because Fair Vote was always really interested in understanding how voting systems impact outcomes for different constituencies of people. And women, of course, are the major constituency, the majority of people in the world. So we were already studying the impact of voting systems on women's representation around the globe. And it made sense to bring some of those best practices that we are finding of what's going on around the globe for use in the United States. So in 2018, I started this. We became independent from Fair Vote. We got status from the IRS as a independent organization. We got some funding, importantly, and hired some staff. So we now have a staff of 10, 5 full-time people, 5 part-time people. And we are very focused. Our mission is focused on researching the barriers that women face in politics, both as candidates and as elected officials, and understanding what the best practices are to address those barriers through changing institutions, changing structures, changing rules and systems. Much like Title IX was a systems change to expand opportunities for girls in education, and the Voting Rights Act was a systems change, and the Americans with Disability Act was a systems change, and suffrage itself was a rule change. So we're looking at all the rules changes that can help to level the playing field for women in politics, and that's what our organization is devoted to.
So are you looking to create a new piece of legislation, or you're trying to work with some existing legislation?
That's a good question. We've identified sort of four main buckets of work, or if you will, if you think of a woman's political lifespan, we think of reforms so that more women are recruited to run for office. So what can parties do and political action committees do to make sure women are recruited to run and then funded when they run? Those are all in the women running for office bucket. Then we look at barriers and solutions in the winning bucket. That's where ranked choice voting comes in. So once they're running, how can we really create an electoral system that removes the barriers of incumbency and uncompetitive elections? So we have run, we have win. Then once women have won, what are the reforms that are necessary, that are working in other countries to ensure that they can serve effectively? So things like the timing of legislative sessions, or is there paid childcare? Is there paid leave? What's the transportation benefit for women who are serving? We have found through this work that some legislatures hardly pay their legislators any money at all. So it really would be difficult for a working person to hold that as a job. So those are the kinds of policies that we're trying to replicate in state legislatures and cities, et cetera, across the country, so that women can serve effectively. And then the last bucket of work are reforms so that women can really lead. Once they've run, they've won, they're serving, how can we sort of institutionalize women's leadership? For example, create gender balanced cabinets and gender balanced decision making, and ensure that men candidates, when they run, are encouraged to choose a woman as a running mate, all in keeping in mind the need to have women in real leadership positions, not just counting up the numbers in a state legislature, but to make sure we're really building women's political power along the way. So
That's wonderful. So
that's a
there's that one
nutshell.
example about the one legislator, and I can't even remember where it was, but she was nursing, and
Oh,
they
Buffy
wouldn't
Wicks.
allow her a
Yes.
proxy to vote. And and so she literally came down to the floor and nursing her child so she could vote.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the kind of thing that, boy, talk about upsetting the apple cart.
Oh yeah.
That's a bit of a heavy lift in some places, but that seems like an obvious thing. If we are expecting women to care for their children, then we need to allow them to both serve in office and care for their children at the same time.
Yeah, there has to be some accommodation. So, right, and I know, I think it was just a couple of years ago that the FEC allowed childcare expenses to be paid out of a campaign fund. But of course,
Exactly.
and I don't know, have states taken on that position as well now? I mean,
There's a
ours is not.
terrific organization called the Vote Mama Foundation that has had exceptional success working on legislation in a number of states. I don't know which ones have been most successful off the top of my head, but any listeners who are interested in that should look at the Vote Mama Foundation and see what they've done and where their focus is.
Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, I've worked with, well, 29 women in 2020, another 19 women in 2022, and many of them, their kids are older, but now women are getting involved with younger kids. And that's a huge problem. I mean, it's just a huge issue. Our
Absolutely.
Secretary of State had a candidate, had a we weren't working with her directly, but we had a terrific Secretary of State candidate this year, who had a young child, 3 years old, and really struggled.
Yeah.
I'm sure, that was just very difficult.
Yes, another policy that just seems obvious is being able to participate, particularly in committee hearings virtually. Some states allow that, but think of somebody who lives in San Diego having to get all the way to Sacramento for a committee hearing. But if you can participate virtually, and then, as you say, have an option to have a proxy vote when necessary, both of those things really enable a more level playing field for women who are serving.
Absolutely. Okay, so now, you were just back from Reykjavik at the International Forum of something.
Yes, Reykjavik Global Forum, yes.
Okay, and so, and I know from some of your other materials that you learned a lot about the UN goals for women in government and women's representation, and so would love to hear about your experience over there and what you learned.
Yes, well, it was just a fabulous opportunity to be invited, organized by Women Political Leaders, which is based in Brussels, which gathers, I think this is the 5th year of the Reykjavik Global Forum. Maybe it started in 2018. Don't quote me on that. But one of the reasons Reykjavik is the host for this is they had the first democratically elected woman president, whom I met when I was there, and they have had a high percentage of women in their parliament, and they really are a model in many ways for the kind of women's leadership that we're talking about on this program today. So that was exciting. There were a few representatives of nonprofit organizations like Represent Women. Running Start was well represented there. That's headed by my friend Susanna Welford, that does fabulous work with young women, getting more young women in politics. And then there were a number of women who are really making great strides in the private sector, people from MasterCard and a number of big companies that are setting targets for the number of women on corporate boards and so forth. So I found that really exciting, really interesting parallels, I think, between what we can do or what is happening in the private sector and how we can have the private sector partner with the public sector more to do things like the recruiting of women for positions. And it's interesting one that relates actually to something I meant to say about opportunities in Indiana are all of the appointed positions, the boards and commissions and so forth, really working to make sure that women are well represented, particularly on boards where key decisions are being made. A lot of those, of course, are not elected, but they're appointed, and that's sometimes a strategy for increasing women's representation and their visibility in a community. And then once they've served effectively as the chair of a commission, they may be in a stronger position to run for elected office. But one of the other exciting things about the Reykjavik Global Forum was, as you mentioned, the folks from the UN women were there, who of course are really pushing the global network hard to meet the goals, the sustainable development goals that were established more than 25 years ago, and really pushing for increased women's representation. One of the reasons I like being in that community is pretty much every member of parliament you run into knows all about voting systems like ranked choice voting and proportional representation, and they all support gender quotas. So it's a very encouraging group to be part of. One nice thing that we did that they organized for us was a visit to the home of the president and his wife, which is situated between two bodies of water. And talk about just leadership, inspired leadership. They were great, talked a lot about all of the policy changes that they are pushing for in Iceland to make sure that women can do all those things we just talked about: run, win, serve, and lead, essentially childcare and paid leave and all the things the United States has yet to do, but we need to do.
Yeah, so why do you think that is? I mean, there's gender quotas in parliaments, in many, many countries, but not here. And of course, the minute you say quota in the United States, everyone, gets their hackles up. And I'm sure it would be the same with this kind of quota. Why do you think that is? People are so, all right, they're tolerant of those kinds of quotas in those other countries, but not here.
Yeah, I think there are a number of things. I think I think often political strategists make a calculation about what seems viable, and I think they're doing their best to think what seems plausible. In my experience, we have a problem with not thinking big enough. I think that so that's part of the problem is we often feel like we need to make very small incremental steps, but I think the lesson we're learning and the lesson we should learn from the 22 midterm elections is that making incremental changes just is insufficient to get us where we need to go. We gained one woman in the US House of Representatives, despite what, $8 or $9 billion in money spent on federal offices. So it is true that if you mention gender quotas in a room full of political consultants or elected officials, they're going to say, "Oh, that's impossible." But frankly, nobody knows what's possible. And I also think part of the challenge in the United States is that we have a different history than a lot of the Latin American and European and African nations that have been really emerging as democracies in the last couple hundred years. The United States has a very old form of democracy that we inherited from the UK. And frankly, other countries, New Zealand, Australia, that also inherited this system have now done away with it because it was so unrepresentative. So I know it can be done, but there's a certain kind of an American exceptionalism and sort of a rugged individualism in the United States, which in some respects, I think can be admired and there's strength there. But I also think we've gotten out of the habit of looking at best practices and what's working around the globe. And I think if we can rededicate ourselves to looking to see what's working in other countries and in local office, for that matter, in places like Utah or Alaska, I think that will help to change the conversation.
Let's hope. It felt like a kind of a big step backward in 2022.
Yes,
Um,
yeah.
That
It
was
did, and I think that
disappointing.
one of the things that we are focused on is we've done a lot of research on what are those system strategies that seem to really have the biggest impact. And what we've identified are things like ranked choice voting has a huge impact. Jurisdictions with ranked choice voting are electing almost 50% women, so that's pretty compelling. But we also need the hands-on work of groups like yours and Emerge and Running Start and Vote Run Lead and She Should Run and all these other groups out there, Higher Heights, that are recruiting women to run and helping them run viable campaigns and making sure that they're running in races where we think they can win. So it's really what we're calling a twin track approach. We need the strategies that prepare individual women coupled with the strategies that level the playing field for women when they run.
Wow. All right. Well, what wonderful work you are doing. That's really exciting. Of course, I gate that Indiana's just not keeping up, just not representing well, which is really unfortunate. I think we may have actually lost women in the state legislature this time. We have more Republican women than Democratic women in the Senate anyway, more than double the amount. So Republicans are, they seem to be kind of getting on the program.
Yes.
And Democrats, unfortunately, don't seem to be getting on that program as well. So, and I want to talk about, one last thing. I noticed that you are writing in so many different publications, and I just want to mention them all so that people can find you. Let's see, Washington Post, New York Times, The Hill, Refinery 29, which I don't know what it is, The Nation, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the American Prospect, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Baltimore Sun, Christian Science Monitor. So I love it that, and you do this a weekly column for Ms. Magazine. So that's really great. And I'm sure that's keeping you very busy.
It does feel a little busy, but it's a good kind of busy. I feel really fortunate to be able to do this work and meet so many terrific women like you who are working on the ground in states, and we've got a lot to learn from each other, don't we?
We do. We need to, be more connected. So,
Yes,
so I really appreciate your other organization. I hope that we can participate in that.
I
So
hope so
tell us,
too.
what are you writing about now, and what are you going to write about next week?
Oh, that's a great question. Let's see. Last week I was feeling very grateful for all the amazing organizations we've get to work with. So it was a column filled with a lot of gratitude for all the groups in the women's representation ecosystem and in the democracy reform space that are just doing amazing things. Groups like Fair Vote working to reform the way we nominate candidates to be president using ranked choice voting and for primaries and caucuses and presidential elections, and all the way down to reforms happening at the local level. So feeling really grateful on that. I think that this next week I see we have a nice chat function that my staff uses, and they've been posting some really interesting stories on some of the work that's being done in Brussels and in Europe in particular on advancing women's representation. So I'll probably touch on that and then touch on some of the election results in the United States as well. One thing, I think I mentioned it already this last week, but it doesn't hurt to say it again. We finally got the results of the Alaska race, and we saw that Republican Lisa Murkowski won the ranked choice voting election with a solid majority, and Democrat Mary Peltola won, becoming the first Alaska Native elected to Congress from Alaska. So we may report on that again because it's such good news.
That is good news. Yeah, and I did see the statistic today that we had zero women of color, or African American women, I guess I think specifically, in the U.S. Senate,
Yeah.
um,
And
which
no
is
Black women governors. It is really, when you think of, particularly if putting a partisan hat on, when you think of the backbone of the Democratic Party, it is just, it seems pretty clear that we need to change some rules and
right,
systems
right.
to make sure.
African American women are the most reliable Democratic voters
Yeah.
out there, and
There,
yet
there are a
they're
couple
not
of
represented.
women that I'll mention, people who are good to read. There's a woman named Danielle Allen who headed something called the American Academy of Arts and Science, Our Common Purpose Report, which I encourage everybody to Google. It's a really great list of reforms, both in political reform and civic reform. Danielle Allen is a professor at Harvard, and she ran briefly in the Democratic primary for governor in the state of Massachusetts, but she's often written in the Washington Post and elsewhere. And one of our board members is another particularly good person to follow, is Amber McReynolds. She's the lone woman and lone independent on the U.S. Postal Board. She's very involved in election administration and in making sure every voter gets a ballot that they can submit in a timely manner. So there's some real great people out there, great secretaries of state, Maggie Toulouse Oliver and Shanna Bellows in Maine, and great members of Congress. We just have to, I think, take it to the next level, don't we? Where we are
Yes,
learning about what the best practices are and having a big vision for what's possible and pushing ahead.
that's great. All right. Well, I mean, I'm feeling a lot better since talking to you, so I really appreciate that.
Well,
And
I'm so glad, and we just refreshed our website now. I will add, and so it's still in beta version. We're still working out some of the kinks, but we now have a much better search function, and we do have a lot of great research. We have something called the Gender Parity Index, which grades states on their women's representation. We've got reports on ranked choice voting and on international women's representation, and on what happened in New York City and on the 100 largest cities. So hope that listeners will go to our website and search for things of interest. We also have reports on first gen representation and disabled women's representation and incarcerated women's representation. We're really trying to understand the barriers, not only for all women, but for subsets of women as well, so we can better understand the best practices to address those barriers.
excellent, excellent. And what is the website?
Representwomen.org.
Okay, great, great. All right, great. All right, well, we are out of time. And so
Thank
I
you.
just want to thank you so much. It's been just, again, made me feel a lot better
I'm
than
so
I
glad.
did before. So, and I'm not thinking about moving, I guess, as much as I was, you know, few minutes ago. So, so anyway, thank you again for coming on and, and talking with me. This is so exciting. You're doing such great work. And I really think, just excited about everything you're doing and want to follow everything.
Excellent. Well, good. Well, likewise, and look forward to working together in the future.
All right.